Well, hello everybody and welcome back to Drawing to Learn Anatomy with Khoa. This is going to be the first part in the two-part video about the circle Willis. If you guys would like to know how you can draw out the origins of the vessels that makes up the circle Willis, like in this picture below, then please stay on till the end of this video. Well, hello everybody and welcome back to Drawing Anatomy with Khoa. My name is Khoa, lecturer of anatomy, physiology, and medical terminology. And today we will be looking at and draw out the circle Willis. This is going to be part one of the two parts that we will be talking about the arteries that makes up the circle of Willis, which is a very important arterial circle at the base of your brain that will provide all of the blood vessels that is needed to nourish your brain and other intracranial structures. Okay, so in this part one, we will be looking at the origin of the two vessels system that eventually makes up the circle Willis, including the internal carotid system and the Vertebrobasilar system. All right, so now three disclaimers just like we always have. Number one, we will actually need two pens in order to do this exercise. The first pen is a black pen. And this black pen is all about the structures. And these structures are the structures of the skull and the structure of the cervical spine. Then we'll have a red pen. And this red pen is all about drawing out the vessels, in this case the arteries, that makes up the two arterial system aforementioned. And then finally, we will have another pen, which is only I'm going to have. This is a blue pen. And this blue pen is all about doing the labels. So I'm going to label these structures using these blue pen for you guys. But you guys don't have to. You guys can just label the structure with the same pen that you guys use to draw either the structures or the artery. That's fine. So either the black one or the red one will be fine. But I will be using the blue pen for labeling. All right. And then we will have the second disclaimer. The second disclaimer is, even though I will try to draw at a reasonable speed so that everybody will be able to follow me in drawing out these structures, sometimes I do admit that I do tend to go a little bit too fast. And if that is the case, then you can just pause the video, catch up with me, and then we can go on together. And then finally, anatomical variation is very much a thing. And please do not expect that everybody's circle Willis is going to be the same. It's not going to be, especially when we get to part two. You guys will see that some vessels like the posterior communicating artery and the anterior communicating artery are going to be different, really depending on whose circle Willis it is. Sometimes you will see that there will be a very, very small posterior communicating artery on one side or even the two sides. Sometimes you will see that there are a double number of posterior communicating arteries on both sides. And sometimes you'll see the same thing happening in the anterior communicating artery. So there are a lot of anatomical variations when it comes to the circle Willis. And that is something we do have to live with. All right, so now after we have done all of that, let us use the black pen now. And we'll use the black pen in order to draw out the structures of the skull and then the cervical spine. And for these structures, we are just going to draw it very simply. We are not going to go into all of the details, but we are going to be drawing it very simply, starting with the skull. Let's draw out the dome of the skull, also called the calvarium. And at the base here, we will have the base of the skull. And we will draw it just like this. Very, very simply, like this. Now, you can add a couple of details. Like, for example, you can add the nasal hole right there, as well as like the orbits, in order to make it a little bit more like a skull. But if not, it's okay too, because we are drawing it very, very simply like this. Then at the base of the skull, this is important. Please draw out three holes. Okay, there is this one hole right here in the back. It is very, very big, and that is going to be the foramen magnum. Then we are going to have the two holes on the lateral sides, one here and one there, a little bit more anterior and two lateral sides of the foramen magnum. And those are going to be the carotid canal. Okay, so now let's label some structures. This one is going to be the foramen magnum. And then we will have this one being the left carotid canal. And we will have the same carotid canal on the right side as well. All right, so now that we are done with this, let us draw out the cervical spine. The cervical spine we can draw out by drawing two lines here and then connecting these lines in the middle. And when we connect them like that, we will form these structures that are the vertebrae of the cervical spine. And as you probably already know, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. Okay, so this is going to be the C1, which is called the atlas. Then we'll have C2, which is the axis. Then C3, C4, C5, C6, and finally C7. Then, for each of these cervical vertebrae, we will have these 2 transverse processes on either side like this, and we will have to draw them all for every single one of our cervical vertebra. This can be a little bit of a boring task, but it is very, very important because these will play a role later on. So we do have to persevere. Here, and then right here, and finally on 7, we'll draw it like that. Okay, then we will notice that each of these transverse process is going to have a hole that is on them, like these ones. And these are called the transverse foramina. And they're all going to be present on the transverse processes of the cervical spine, like this. Okay, and these transverse foramina are very important because this is the way that the vertebral arteries is going to ascend to get into the skull later on. So now, as we already drawn out the structures of the skull and the cervical spine, we will now change our pen to a red pen. And in this red pen, we will draw out the arteries. And we will begin with drawing out the arterial arch that is down here. Most of you would already guess that this arterial arch is the aortic arch. And at the aortic arch, you will see there will be normally 3 vessels branching out from the aortic arch. This is the first one. This is our second one. And finally, our third one, like this. Our first artery coming out from the aortic arch is this one. And that one is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Or the brachiocephalic artery. Then we will have this structure right there. And that one is the second branch out of the aortic arch, namely the left common carotid artery, or CCA, left CCA. Then we are going to have another one going out from here, and that one is the left subclavian artery. Okay, so we are going to extend these arteries up a little bit. And when we extend them upward like this, you will see that the brachiocephalic trunk is going to divide into 2, like that. One traveling this way, towards the upper limb. And that artery right there, going to the upper limb, is indeed the right subclavian artery. Then we will have this artery right here, and that artery is the right common carotid artery, or right CCA. All right, so now we are going to follow these arteries up a little bit, and we'll begin with the 2 common carotid arteries. The 2 common carotid arteries will ascend like this, up in a structure that is called the carotid sheath. And now, as the common carotid arteries get to the level of C4, the 4th cervical vertebra, they will divide into 2, like that, on both sides. So, you will have the one that goes to the lateral side like that is going to be the external carotid artery, In this case, we have the left external carotid artery. Then the one that going in or more medial than this is called the internal carotid artery. And this one, alongside with the right internal carotid artery, will get into the skull and eventually form the branches, the terminal branches that contribute to the circle of Willis on the anterior side. So now, let us go with the internal carotid arteries up like this. Okay, we will not worry about the external carotid in this drawing, but we will follow the internal carotid arteries. When it gets to the base of the skull, these arteries are going to enter the skull via the two carotid canals on both sides. Okay, and we'll go like that. And on its journey, there are going to be a couple of parts of the internal carotid artery. We will have this part right here when it's still in the neck. It is called the cervical part, okay, or extracranial part. Then, as it goes into the carotid canal, it will travel within what is known as the petrous part of the temporal bone. So we will have a petrous part of the internal carotid artery. Then it will exit the petrous part and go into a venous sinus within the skull. That venous sinus is called the cavernous sinus, and therefore that part of the internal carotid artery will be called the cavernous part. That's an R there. Cavernous part of the internal carotid artery. Before finally, the last part of the internal carotid artery, right there, that would be the intracranial part of the internal carotid artery. And this intracranial part eventually is going to go to either side of a structure that is called the sella turcica. And when you get there, the intracranial part of the ICA is going to divide into terminal branches that forms the anterior part of the circle Willis. So now, we will get down to the levels of the aortic arch again. And instead of looking at the common carotid arteries, we will now look at the subclavian arteries. Because from the subclavian arteries on both sides, we will have two arteries that goes up like that. These are the first branches out from the subclavian arteries on both sides, and they are the vertebral arteries. Okay, so this case, we have the left vertebral artery, okay, and then we'll also have the right vertebral artery. And these two vertebral arteries are going to do something that is a little bit strange. They will actually enter these transverse foramina here and travel up like that. This side is going to be the same, and they will travel up like this. Now, note how they did not enter C7's transverse foramen. But the first transverse foramina that they will enter into are C6's transverse foramina. Okay, and they will go for the transverse foramina of C6, then C5, then C4, C3, and then finally C1. And at the level of C1, they will exit the transverse foramina of C1 and go medially and superiorly like that until they get into the foramen magnum on either side. And as they pass into the foramen magnum and into the skull, they join together like that. And this artery right here, the result of the joining of the two vertebral arteries, is going to be called the basilar artery. Okay, and the two internal carotid arteries, as well as the basilar artery, is going to coalesce together and form terminal branches in order to create that circle. And that circle is indeed the circle of Willis. Okay, so to recap, the circle of Willis is going to be formed by two systems of arteries. The two internal carotid arteries on either side and the two vertebral arteries from either side. The internal carotid arteries are going to go through the carotid canal in order to get into the skull, while the vertebral arteries will go through the foramen magnum in order to get into the skull. When they are in the skull, the vertebral arteries will join to become the basilar artery, and the two branches of the ICA as well as the basilar artery will form the circle of Willis. Okay. In this video, we will actually not go through all of the branches that comes out of the circle of Willis because that is going to be covered in part 2. All right, everybody, and that is the end of part 1, which is the origins of the vessels of the circle of Willis. Thank you very, very much for joining me today. If you have a question about any of this, please leave a comment so that I may address these questions as soon as possible. If you like this video, please click the like button so that I will be recognized by the YouTube algorithm. And if you want to keep up with more contents like this in the future, please click the subscribe button. My name is Khoa. Thank you very much once again, and I will see you in part 2 of the video, The Circle of Willis. Bye-bye.